Protecting the consumer, product safety and marketing. Consumer protection. Free market capitalism and consumer safety are often at odds, as the pursuit of profit by businesses can sometimes conflict with the need to ensure the safety and well-being of consumers. The tension between these two priorities is rooted in the concept of caveat emptor, which is Latin for let the buyer beware. This principle suggests that consumers are responsible for ensuring that the products they purchase are safe and effective, and that businesses are not necessarily responsible for the consequences of their actions. However, over time, governments have established rules and regulations to protect consumers from harm and to ensure that businesses are held accountable for their actions. These rules range from safety standards for consumer products to regulations governing financial markets and the sale of goods and services. The goal of these rules is to protect consumers from harm, ensure that businesses operate in an ethical and responsible manner, and promote fair competition in the marketplace. One example of the rules designed to protect consumers is the Consumer Product Safety Act, which was passed by the U.S. Congress in 1972. It established safety standards for consumer products and created the Consumer Product Safety Commission to enforce these standards. The Commission has the authority to recall unsafe products and to impose penalties on companies that violate safety regulations. Another example of rules designed to protect consumers is the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, which was passed in response to the 2008 financial crisis. The law established new regulations for financial markets and created the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to protect consumers from predatory lending practices and other forms of financial fraud. Business regulations versus capitalism. These rules and regulations are designed to address the tension between free market capitalism and consumer safety by establishing clear standards for businesses to follow and by holding them accountable for their actions. However, there are still debates about the appropriate balance between these two priorities. Some argue that too much regulation can stifle innovation and impede economic growth, leading to higher cost and reduced competition in the marketplace. They argue that consumers should be responsible for making informed choices about the products they purchase and that businesses should be free to operate in a competitive market without excessive regulation. Others argue that businesses have a responsibility to ensure the safety and well-being of their customers and that regulations are necessary to prevent harmful products and practices from entering the marketplace. They argue that consumers may not always have the knowledge or resources to make informed choices, and that regulations are necessary to level the playing field and ensure fair competition. Regulation of tobacco. It is axiomatic that advertisers have an ethical duty to avoid deception, to avoid impairing consumer autonomy and decision-making. However, exactly where to draw that line is complex, as shown by the history of government regulation of the tobacco industry. The history of U.S. government regulation of the tobacco industry is a long and complex one. The first significant efforts to regulate tobacco came in the early 20th century with the passage of laws banning the sale of cigarettes to minors and prohibiting the advertisement of tobacco products in certain media. However, these early efforts were limited in scope and largely ineffective. It was not until the 1960s that the government began to take more aggressive steps to regulate the tobacco industry. In 1964, the Surgeon General released a report linking smoking to a range of health problems, including lung cancer and heart disease. This report helped to raise public awareness about the dangers of smoking and paved the way for new regulations. Still, the industry reacted by insisting smoking was safe and ran ads like "More doctors smoke Camel." In 1965, Congress passed the Federal Cigarette Labeling and Advertising Act, which required that all cigarette packages carry warning labels about the health risks of smoking. This was followed in 1970 by the Public Health Cigarette Smoking Act, which banned cigarette advertising on radio and television. In the decades that followed, the government continued to implement new regulations aimed at reducing tobacco use and protecting public health. These included restrictions on smoking in public places, higher taxes on cigarettes, and new warning labels that covered a large portion of cigarette packages. However, the tobacco industry fought back against these regulations, arguing that they violated their First Amendment rights and would harm their business. The industry also engaged in aggressive lobbying efforts to prevent new regulations from being implemented and to water down existing regulations. Despite these efforts, the government continued to implement new regulations aimed at reducing tobacco use and protecting public health. In 2009, President Obama signed the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act, which gave the FDA the authority to regulate tobacco products and to restrict their sale and marketing to minors. This was a significant milestone in the history of U.S. government regulation of the tobacco industry, as it gave the government greater control over the manufacturing, marketing, and distribution of tobacco products. Regulation of automobiles. The automobile industry has been regulated in the United States for many years with a range of laws and regulations designed to ensure the safety of drivers and passengers. However, there have been numerous instances of regulatory failures and scandals in the industry, including the Chevy Cobalt ignition switch crisis, the Ford Pinto rear-end car explosions, and Takata's airbag crisis. The Chevy Cobalt ignition switch crisis occurred in 2014 when it was discovered that some Chevrolet Cobalt vehicles had a faulty ignition switch that could cause the car to shut off unexpectedly while in motion. This defect was linked to at least 124 deaths and 275 injuries, leading to a massive recall of affected vehicles. It was later discovered that General Motors had known about the defect for over a decade, but had failed to take action, leading to widespread criticism of the company and calls for increased regulation of the industry. In the 1970s, Ford produced the Pinto, the subcompact car that had a design flaw in its fuel system. In rear-end collisions, the fuel tank could rupture and explode, leading to fires and severe injuries or death. It was later revealed that Ford had conducted cost-benefit analyses that showed it would be cheaper to pay off lawsuits resulting from accidents than to recall and repair the vehicles. This scandal led to increased scrutiny of the automobile industry and ultimately led to new safety regulations and increased liability for manufacturers. The Takata airbag crisis was a more recent scandal that affected millions of vehicles and resulted in at least 27 deaths and 400 injuries worldwide. It was discovered that Takata, a major supplier of airbags to the automobile industry, had used a volatile chemical in its airbags that could cause them to rupture and spray shrapnel when deployed. This defect led to massive recalls of affected vehicles and lawsuits against Takata and its customers. The crisis highlighted the need for greater oversight of suppliers in the industry that led to calls for increased regulation of the supply chain. To prevent further crises, it is important to have robust regulatory frameworks in place that require manufacturers to prioritize safety and that hold them accountable for any defects or failures that occur. Additionally, increased transparency and accountability in the supply chain can help to identify potential risks and prevent issues before they become crises.